Namo Buddhaya. Good evening. Welcome to the Buddha Dharma TV. I'm Lisa Chu. Our program, as usual, begins today with invoking blessings for the happiness and well-being of everyone on the planet and beyond. This is a tribute to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, affectionately known as paying homage to the Triple Gem. Today, it is led by the venerable monks at Dharmakaya Temple in Bangkok, Thailand.
นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโต
อะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะ
พุทธังสรณัง
คัจฉามิธัมมังสรณังคัจฉามิสังฆังสรณังคัจฉามิทุติยัมปิพุทธังสรณังคัจฉามิทุติยัมปิธัมมังสรณังคัจฉามิทุติยัมปิสังฆังสรณังคัจฉามิตติยัมปิพุทธังสรณังคัจฉามิตติยัมปิธัมมังสรณังคัจฉามิตติยัมปิสังฆังสรณังคัจฉามิ
สัมพุทเท
อัตตวิสัญจะทวาทสัญจะสหัสสะเกปัญจะสตัสสหัสสานินามามิสิรสาอะหังเตสังฆัมมันจะสังฆันจะอาทะเลนะนามามิหังนะมะการานุภาเวนะหันตวาสัพเพอุปัฏฐเวอเนกาอันตรายาปิวินาสันตุอาเสสะโตสัมพุทเทปัญจปัญญาสันจะจตุวิสติสหัสสะเกทัสสะสตัสสหัสสานินามามิสิรสาอะหังเตสังฆัมมันจะสังฆันจะอาทะเลนะนามามิหังนะมะการานุภาเวนะหันตวาสัพเพอุปัฏฐเวอเนกาอันตรายาปิวินาสันตุอาเสสะโตสัมพุทเทนวุตรสเตอัตตจัตตาริสสหัสสะเกวิสติสตัสสหัสสานินามามิสิรสาอะหังเตสังฆัมมันจะสังฆันจะอาทะเรนะนามามิหังนะมะการานุภาเวนะหันตวาสัพเพอุปัฏฐเวอเนกาอันตรายาปิวินาสันตุอาเสสัตโต
นะโมอะระหะโต
สัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะมะเหสิโนนะโมอุตตมธัมมัสสะสวากขาตัสเสวะเตนิทันนะโมมหาสังฆัสสะปิวิสุทธัสสีลทิติโนนะโมโอมาตยารัตตัสสะรัตนาตยาสัสสาธุกา ตังนะโมโอมกาติตาสตัสสวัตถุตยาสปินะโมการัปปภาเวนวิคัจฉันตุปัตตวานะโมการานุภาเวนสุวัตติโหตุสัพพทานะโมการาสเตเชนวิคิมหิโหมิเตชวา
พหูเทวามนุสสาจะมังคลานิอจินตยุงอากังขมานาโสธานังปรหิมังคลมุตตมังอเสวนาจะพาลานังปันติตานันจะเสวนาปูชาจะปูชนียานังเอตัมมังคลมุตตมังปฏิรูปเทสวาโสจะปุเพจะกตปุญญาตาอัตตสัมมาปณิทิจะเอตัมมังคลมุตตมังพาหุสัจจันจะสิปัญจวินโยจะสุสิขิโตสุภาสิตาจะยาวาจาเอตัมมังคลมุตตมังมาตาปิตุอุปัฏฐานังปุตตธาราสสังฆโหอนาคุลาจะกัมมันตาเอตัมมังคลมุตตมังทานันจะธรรมจริยาจะยาตกานันจะสังฆโหอนวัชชานิกัมมานิเอตัมมังคลมุตตมังอารติวิรติปาปามาจปานาจะสัญญโมอัปปมาทัวจะธรรมเมสุเอตัมมังคลมุตตมังคารโวจะนิวาตัวจะสันตุทีจะกตัญยุตากาเลนะธรรมาสวนังเอตัมมังคลมุตตมังขันติจะโสวจัสสตาสมนานันจะทัสสนังกาเลนะธรรมสากัจฉาเอตัมมังคลมุตตมังตโปจะพรหมจริยันจะอริยสัจจานัทธัสสนังนิพพานสัจจิกิริยาจะเอตัมมังคลมุตตมังพุทธัสสะโรกธรรมเมหิจิตตังยาสนกรรมปฏิอโศกังวิราชังเขมังเอตัมมังคลมุตตมังเอตาทิสานิกตวานสัตพัทธมปราชิตาสัพพัทธโสทิงขัดฉันติตันเตสังฆังคลมุตตมันติ
Everyone talks about heaven, and everyone wants to go there. Many people don't know what heaven is or where it exists. Is going to heaven just a fairy tale? But it's good to know how to get there. We have a learned monk, Venerable Dr. Bhante Punaji, who has shared with us how we can get to heaven. He's talking about how living a good life can lead to it.
The topic that has been given, of course, is not something that I chose, but it has been given, and that is about how to go to heaven. One very important thing that we must understand is that there are two kinds of religion. They are called Deva Dharma and Buddha Dharma. These are two different things. Deva Dharma is the Dharma given by Devas. And the Buddha Dharma is the Dharma given by the Buddha. That word Dharma is being used to refer to the teachings of the Buddha and the teachings of Deva. So we have to understand the meaning of the word Deva and the meaning of the word Buddha. Now in modern terminology, that means the words used in modern thinking, and if you study about religion and maybe even comparative religion, the modern university studies and thinking, they speak of we can speak of two kinds of religion. One is called theistic religion, and another is called humanistic religion. So it is this theistic religion that considers religion to be something that has come down from heaven to earth, carrying the message of the creator of the world, or maybe it is the message coming from the supernatural beings called gods. And when we talk about the humanistic religion, we are talking about a religion that has grown up on earth to satisfy a human need. To solve a human problem. Using human intelligence. These are two ways of thinking. It is very important to understand that. Now, what we call Buddhism is a humanistic religion. We are not talking about a religion that has come down from heaven to earth. We are talking about a religion that has grown up on earth to satisfy a human need, to solve a human problem. Now, in the western part of the world, there is a period that started in the 18th century, that period is a period when science began. And it was during that period that there was Isaac Newton, Galileo, and all these various kinds of scientists came up. And they brought into consideration a very important truth about life. And that truth is called determinism. And determinism means that everything that happens in the world, all the natural occurrences in the world, they occur only due to the presence of the necessary conditions. When the conditions are present, it happens. When the conditions are absent, it doesn't happen. What this means is, in ancient times, people didn't know this. People thought that when there was rain, or when there was thunder, when there was lightning, or when there is an earthquake, or when there is something like tsunami, all these things happen only because God is doing this, or gods are doing this. The world is controlled by these supernatural beings. And that is why they began to pray to the gods to help, to get help from the gods, to change our circumstances. But when this science began to come up, people began to understand that things happen not because of gods and devils and supernatural beings. Only when the necessary conditions are present, it happens. When the conditions are absent, it doesn't happen. So when this idea got into the minds of the educated people, they lost faith in the religious dogmas. When they lost faith in the religious dogmas, something happened. Because these religions, although they were talking about these supernatural beings, they were also talking about another important thing. And that is, there is a problem with these human beings. That problem is, these human beings sometimes begin to become greedy for things, And sometimes they begin to become angry. And as a result, they begin to harm other people. And they begin to fight and quarrel. And so this religion has been pointing out there are some laws of these gods. Gods have laid down rules for the human beings. And God will punish the human beings for doing the wrong things. And the gods will reward the human beings if they live a good life. So that idea of punishment and reward became necessary to make the human beings live in the proper way. So when they began to lose faith in the human religion, the idea of good and bad also became challenged. So they started saying, well, if there is no God, we don't have to worry about being good. If we are not going to be good, we can kill and fight and quarrel, we can steal, we can commit adultery. All these things can be done, we won't be punished. So that became a problem. They lost faith in the religious dogmas, and they lost also the idea of good and bad, right and wrong. So that became a problem. So religion was not only speaking about supernatural beings and supernatural powers, he was also talking about being good and avoiding being bad. So this is a problem. But now, when we talk about the teachings of the Buddha, the Buddha, it was the Buddha who pointed out the importance of being good, not because of the fear of punishment. We can be good without the fear of punishment. And that is by becoming what is today called becoming civilized. Now, what is being civilized? To become civilized is to broaden the mind. broadening the mind. Our normal life is a selfish life. A selfish mind is a narrow mind. Narrow because we are only thinking about ourselves. If we are thinking only about myself, only I want to be happy, I don't care about other people, only I should be happy, and I don't want to be unhappy. And in order for me to be happy, I have to look after myself and satisfy my desires. That is the narrow way of thinking. And it is because of this narrow way of thinking that people begin to fight with one another. And today, if we look into the animal world, what we notice is all animals are self-centered. They are only worried about their own food and their own life. And one animal lives by eating other animals. If you go into the animal channel where they talk about animals, you'll begin to see that when one animal begins to go in search of food, another animal comes and catches that animal and eats. So while going in search of food, the other animals come and make that animal the food. So if life is like that, so it's a life of insecurity. And today, even the human world, people are doing the same thing. Now, we don't see very much human beings killing other human beings and eating human flesh. But still we find the human beings killing other animals and eating their flesh. But there are some human beings who are called vegetarians. But who are vegetarians? They are also eating living things. Vegetables are also living things. You see, human beings are also living by eating other lives, even the vegetarians. So if this is something that was a creation of God, so it is the God who has done this. But now we have understood that the world is not based on a God or some supernatural being, everything is happening due to the presence of the necessary conditions. Now it is this fact that the Buddha brought into the world long before the Westerners began to understand this law of determinism. The Buddha had a different word for this. He didn't use the word determinism because he was not speaking English. So he used the word paticca samuppada. Paticca samuppada was the same thing. He said, Hetung paticca sambhutang hetu bhanga nirujjati. Hetu means the necessary conditions. Hetung paticca sambhutang, when the conditions are present, it comes into being. When the conditions are absent, it ceases to be. That is the meaning of Hetung paticca sambhutang hetu bhanga nirujjati. So he was talking about determinism. But today, the modern science is based on this law of determinism. Now, you know that even human beings, they cook their food. And to cook the food, they need fire. Now, in the primitive days, they didn't know how to make fire. How did they make fire? When they wanted fire, they had to rub two sticks together for a long time till they became hot. But today we have this thing called the match. We only have to strike a match and the flame comes up. Now we have other methods. We have this thing called electricity. So we can get a flame through electricity. We can cook food even without a flame. We can use what is called the hot plate. It is only heating the plate. You see, so how did human beings find the way of producing a flame? They used this law called determinism, because they were thinking in terms of the necessary conditions to produce something. If you want a flame, what are the conditions necessary for a flame to arise? And they found the conditions and they produced the match, which contains all the necessary conditions to produce the flame. So striking the match is simply making use of what is called friction. And the other conditions were also supplied, not only friction, but there was something like gunpowder at the tip of the match. And there is also another condition, oxygen in the air. All these things are there. So that is how they produced it. In the same way, now they have what is called the motor vehicle that can run at very fast speed. Not only that, they have the airplane that can even fly in the air. So all kinds of things. We have the fan, we have the air conditioning, we have the electric lights. All this, all because we are using human intelligence. It is by using human intelligence that we are able to do these things. So that is why today, when a person falls sick, they don't run to the church, they run to the hospital. Why? If you run to the church, they are the gods in the church who will try to help you. Or you may be praying to the gods. But if you go to the hospital, you get the doctors and the nurses to help you. They use human intelligence. So today people begin to have more faith in human intelligence. And that way of thinking is what is called humanistic thinking. So Buddhism is a humanistic religion. But some people say Buddhism is not a religion, it is just a philosophy. Why do they say that? Because they think religion means believing in these gods and supernatural beings and trying to get help from the gods. That is not true. That is only the theistic religions. Religion is not simply believing in gods. Religion is an effort to solve the problem of existence. Now that is how the Buddha spoke of religion. Religion for the Buddhist is not something that has come down from heaven to earth carrying the message of the Creator. Religion is a way of solving a human problem. And the human problem is the problem of anxieties, worries, fears. It is called the insecurity of life. It is the insecurity of life that needs to be solved. So religion is a method of solving the insecurity of life. This is why the theistic religions have a hope. What is that hope? They hope that they can go to heaven after death. And heaven is a place where there is eternal life and eternal happiness. But what is that hope? That hope is only a belief. No one has seen this heaven. No one has seen these gods. The only way you can see God or heaven is after death, not in this life. But people believe in these gods and heavens only to overcome the fears and worries, the insecurity of life. But the Buddha pointed out that the only way to solve that problem is not to be hoping for something that is only a dream. Which cannot be proved. So instead of hoping for something unknown, we should use our human intelligence and solve the problem. That is why Buddhism is a humanistic religion. And it is through this humanistic way of thinking that the Buddha pointed out that we have to solve the problem by broadening the mind. How do we broaden the mind? To broaden the mind is to go beyond ourselves and to think of all beings, not only people of our family, not only people of our nation, not only human beings, even all animals, even plants, all living things, may all beings be well, comfortable, peaceful and happy. To keep broadening our mind and to think of all beings. That broadening the mind makes us see that our problem is simply a small speck in an ocean of problems. It is like a drop of water in the ocean. The drop of water is nothing when you compare to the waters of the ocean. In the same way, our own problems become nothing compared to the problem of all beings. And they are all suffering. And when our mind becomes broad, we begin to become interested in the welfare of all beings. That my happiness and others' happiness is equal. Others' happiness is as important as my own happiness. So this distinction between myself and the others disappears. Just as the mother is thinking of her only child, that is called karuna. This universal interest in the welfare of all beings is called metta. And thinking of others' happiness equal to our own happiness, that is karuna. When that develops into karuna, what happens? All our unhappiness disappears. Why? Because the self-concern disappears. All unhappiness is self-centered. When the self-centered thinking disappears, all unhappiness disappears. And when all unhappiness disappears, we become happy as a result. That happiness of selflessness is called mudita. So we have metta, karuna and mudita. Mudita is the happiness of selflessness. But that happiness is not an emotional excitement. It is a calm, tranquil state of the mind. When that calm, tranquil state of the mind appears, our attention is focused within, and we begin to discover that there is no self within to worry about. No self to satisfy or defend. Whatever happens in the world outside, gain and loss, fame and ill fame, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. These are the changing vicissitudes of life. When these changing circumstances change, our mind is not disturbed. And when the mind is not disturbed, all unhappiness disappears. And if everyone can broaden the mind in this way, there will be peace and happiness in the world. Here and now. We don't have to wait till we go to heaven after death. We can be happy here and now. And when we are happy here and now, all suffering comes to an end. If there is some kind of rebirth, because our mind is free from selfishness, greed and hatred, if we are reborn, we'll be reborn in a good way. If there is no rebirth, that is also not going to be a problem for us. So you see, it is very important to understand that the teachings of the Buddha is very different from the theistic religions. So the theistic religion is what is called Deva Dharma, and the Buddha Dharma is the humanistic religion, the humanistic way of thinking. So, I hope you understood this.
เรื่องคุณแห่งกรรมจะต้องตอกย้ำจำในใจละชั่วทำดีทำใจให้ใสชีวิตหลังตายจะได้ไปสู่สวรรค์สิ่งที่ต้องรู้ไม่รู้ไม่ได้ชีวิตเวียนว่ายอยู่ในวังวนหลีกเลี่ยงไม่ได้แม้แต่สักคนไม่มีใครพ้นเรื่องกฎแห่งกรรมชีวิตตกต่ำหรือสูงส่งเพราะบาปหรือบุญหากใครใจมองต้องไปอบายมีทุกข์มากมายเพราะบาปคำจุนหากใครใจใสเพราะได้ทำบุญบุญก็เกื้อหนุนให้ไปสู่ที่สุขสบายย้
Our upcoming segment highlights the psychological teachings of Venerable Bhante Kovida from Canada. He will delve into the intricacies of psychology while persuasively discussing the topic, the nature of awakening. Let us welcome Venerable Kovida as he graces us with his insights.
We'll have heard some parts of this already. But it's good to hear it again. And on this journey of awakening, the first thing that we have to realize is that our minds are a result of conditioning. Social conditioning and also, formal education, starting in elementary school or primary school. Because before I went to India and started to get some of these wonderful teachings, I had no idea that my mind was a result of conditioning. Had no idea. Because nobody had ever pointed it out to me. Not even once. So we're conditioned by the society, by education, by the media, by local beliefs, including the childhood fear of ghosts and spirits. We're also conditioned by the climate, by the food, by the culture that surrounds us. And of course, part of our conditioning is language. We can't avoid learning languages. Now, where I grew up in the West Indies, in the other side of the world, on the island of Jamaica, I was conditioned with the belief in African ghosts and spirits. Just like you're conditioned here with Chinese ghosts and spirits. And I really believed them. And I imagined them, and I thought they were real. But only later I began to realize it was just the power of the imagination. So maybe later I can just mention why we believe in ghosts and spirits. Because most cultures believe in some kind of spirits, but there's a reason. There's a reason for this. Now, what the Buddha realized was that he realized the human conditioning and why we have this thing called dukkha, mental, emotional suffering and conflict. And as you know, in essence, he was a very profound psychologist and a psychotherapist. And he saw that the people around him in the Hindu culture suffered a great deal from ignorance and delusion, from mental defilements. And out of that came a lot of fear, anxiety, superstitious beliefs. And that's why they had sacrifices. Not only animal sacrifice, but human sacrifice. So as you know, the path he took was very different. Because he was able to purify his mind of these mental defilements. And as human beings, we all have mental defilements because it's a part of our conditioning. Our minds are conditioned to react. Our brains are programmed, educated to label, judge, criticize, condemn, compare, to like or dislike, to want or not to want, or to have aversion and ill will. And aversion and ill will includes hatred, resentment, jealousy, disrespect, and so on. This is a conditioning of our mental defilements. So this is the cause of our conflicts, discontentment, disharmony, and dis-ease. The idea of a permanent, unchanging ego center or self is strengthened by this conditioning. And it is this deep-rooted illusion of a permanent, concrete, and separate ego entity which is the source and cause of our problems and conflicts, fears and worries, craving, greed, and attachments. So on the journey of awakening, it's important that we understand that we're conditioned beings and we have these mental defilements. And our main defilement is ignorance and delusion. And ignorance means that we have a strong attachment to believe that the self is something permanent and it is something separate. And the reason why this self feels separate is because of the conditioning of duality. So we'll speak about that, how the mind is conditioned with the idea of duality, meaning subject and object. And delusion is something which the mind is constantly being subjected to. But initially we don't realize that our minds are being deluded. And out of ignorance and delusion comes self-centered craving and attachment. Self-centered craving and clinging. And also aversion and ill will. Resentment, jealousy, and so on. And we mentioned before that the qualities of the Buddha are wisdom and mindfulness, simplicity and renunciation, and loving kindness and compassion. And when we look at our mental defilements, which is a result of conditioning, we see that wisdom helps us to overcome ignorance. Right understanding, right view helps us to overcome the strong attachment to the idea of a permanent separate self. And we see that mindfulness helps us to overcome delusion. And we see that simplicity helps us to overcome craving. And renunciation helps us to overcome self-centered attachment and clinging. And loving kindness and compassion helps us to overcome aversion, ill will, hatred, resentment, jealousy, and so on. Now, the reason why we believe that the self is permanent and separate has to do with not only the use of language, but also the duality that we're conditioned with, the idea that I am separate from the world. And duality begins very early, very innocently, when a child begins to speak. When a child begins to say, I like this, I don't like that. I want this, I don't want that. That's the beginning of duality. And duality means subject and object. And the I is always the subject. And this idea of duality, subject and object, becomes more deep-rooted. It seems more solid in the mind when we begin to identify with our sense experiences. I've spoken about this before. When we begin to say, I am seeing something, I am hearing something, I'm tasting something, I'm smelling something, I'm feeling something by touch, and I'm thinking something. So this duality that's conditioned in the mind becomes more deep-rooted, and it seems more solid. That there's an I at the center of all our experiences, including I want, I don't want, I like, I don't like. And we begin to feel that I am separate somehow from the world. I'm separate from nature, even separate from society. And we mentioned before is that because we're caught in this duality, and we're caught in thinking, we ask this question, this very old question, the age-old question. What happens to me when I die, and where do I go after death? That question comes because we are caught in this duality. The feeling that I'm permanent and I'm separate from nature and the world. So that's why we ask that question. So part of the journey of awakening is not only to understand this condition of duality, but to realize that language is what creates this idea of not only duality, but the impression in the mind that I am permanent. because we need language to communicate, and we need labels. We use the word I, you, he, she, just like we use names. And names are really just social labels, so that we can identify each other more easily. But when we investigate, we begin to see that who we really are not these social labels. Yes, we need them in society, and we need them, on all our documents and so on. But they're not really who we are. And I mentioned before that in North America, where I spend a great deal of time, that there are many people there, they become so attached to their names, they identify so strong with their names, that if you call them by a wrong name, by a mistake, or you forget their name, they get very upset. And some people are even very fussy about the way you pronounce their name. They're that fussy, or they're that deluded. And the reason why this self, the I, feels so permanent is because we are using the same label to communicate. And as you know, if you have to speak a lot in one day, you can use this I many, many times. A few hundred times, I would say. And because we were using the same label I, or the equivalent in other languages, we keep saying I all the time. So it gives the impression in the mind, in consciousness, that this I is rock solid and everlasting. It is always there. It's very interesting because we may see changes around us, but the I never changes. And that's why it gives the impression that this I is something permanent. But then when we practice mindfulness, we begin to see that it's just a label that we're using quite often, and sometimes a lot. And once we have that understanding and that awareness, we still use the I to communicate, because we have to communicate, but you no longer are so attached to this I. In other words, you no longer take this I so seriously, because you have that understanding and that awareness that this I is just a label that we're using. So we can laugh at ourselves, we can learn to laugh at ourselves. So the problem is not really the I or the self, but is the strong attachment to it. Taking the I too seriously. Now, delusion, there are many aspects, a few aspects to the nature of delusion. And our main delusion comes from what I've just read. Or a social habit of always reacting. Labeling, judging, comparing, criticizing, condemning, liking, not liking, wanting, not wanting, to have aversion, ill will. And initially we don't see that this is the cause of a lot of our conflicts and suffering. We don't see that it is what is creating our illusion. Because when we're always reacting, we create our own mental, emotional reality, right? And we don't see that we're being deluded by this habit of reacting because everyone does it. It seems like a normal social behavior. But when you begin to practice, to bring awareness in your daily life, then you begin to see that. And this is why it took someone like the Buddha to say, stop reacting. When you see, just see. When you hear, just hear. It's a very radical teaching. And at the same time, it's very challenging. Because although it sounds very simple, but it's very difficult to practice. Because it is such a habit that we all have from early childhood, always reacting. And of course, we need labels to communicate. That's obvious. But what happens is that we become so attached to labels that we forget that labels are just labels. And we often mistake the label for the real thing. And we cling to labels as reality. And a lot of the arguments and conflicts that human beings experience, it's really about labels. Just like we become very attached to views and opinions and so on. So when we have more awareness, we begin to awaken from this delusion. And how we're conditioned to be deluded. And another aspect of delusion is our mental formations, what the mind is always creating. Because the mind tends to create many stories. Our thoughts and images are creating stories all the time in daily life. And some stories are like mini dramas, some of them are worries or fears. And sometimes you begin to worry that, this might happen or that might happen, and it seems very real. Or whatever fears or anxieties we experience, it seems very real. But when we can apply mindfulness, we begin to see that these fears and worries are just temporary mental states. They are not permanent reality. And as you know, when we're not mindful, these mind-created stories and mini-dramas, worries and fears, they seem so real, so permanent. Especially when there are emotions involved. And similarly, we're also deluded by unpleasant memories. And again, unpleasant memories can seem very solid, very permanent when emotions are involved. And I think part of our mental delusions is created by just, again, our social conditioning. Because we're not brought up to understand the benefits of mindfulness and mindfulness practice. And so we become very attached to thinking itself, to the mind itself. And this is why most of us suffer from neurosis to varying degrees. And neurosis is when we're trapped in thinking and we believe that thinking is reality. And to be intelligent, we have to be thinking all the time. And of course, there are varying degrees of neurosis. Sometimes, a mild neurosis, medium neurosis, and of course, severe neurosis. And I'm sure if you've met a very neurotic person, you can tell. You can see even just the way they look. When you meet a very neurotic person, you can see that they're very tense. Especially in the forehead, this area. They're very tense. And they're trapped in thinking, totally trapped in thinking. And I remember when this mind was also, very trapped, very deluded in thinking. So there was a lot of fear, anxiety, worry, and so on. And of course, when you're trapped in thinking, whenever the mind says I, you think this I is who you are, right? And the I, again, seems very, very permanent and very separate, separate from the world, separate from society. And so there's a lot of fear, a lot of insecurity. And not only is the mind caught in judging and criticizing, but also a lot of self-judgment, a lot of self-criticism. And so there's a lot of guilt. And I see, especially in Western societies, a lot of people suffer from guilt. But it has to do with the judgmental mind. And this is why it's very important whenever we make mistakes that we have to forgive ourselves for being human. Because as human beings, we are not perfect. And everyone makes mistakes. Everyone. Of course, it is natural to have regrets. We can all relate to that experience. But if we keep regretting and we keep feeling guilty about things we have done, things we have said, then we end up torturing ourselves. And that is not very healthy. And this is why the practice of loving kindness is so beneficial. Because when we do loving kindness meditation, we replace those negative judgmental thoughts with kind, positive thoughts. May I be well, happy, and peaceful. May I be free from fear, conflict, and delusion. May all beings be well, happy, and peaceful. May all beings be free from fear, conflict, and delusion. Because what is interesting is that guilt is an aspect of fear. Why? Because whenever we start feeling guilty, when we're caught in self-blame, we tend to create a negative image of ourselves. You know, I'm so stupid, I'm so crazy, I'm terrible, I'm awful. So having that negative image plus all the other negative judgmental thoughts that keep arising creates fear, creates conflict in the mind. Just like when you're having conflict with somebody, you tend to create a negative image of that person. Whether it's a close friend, a family member, a co-worker, a neighbor, and so on. It's very interesting because if you're having a pleasant relationship with somebody, then we tend to have a pleasant image of that person, don't we? Because it's related to memory. But the moment you have a conflict with someone, we tend to create a negative image of that person. Because again, it's related to memory. And the mind holds on to that conflict with that negative image. So this is why fear and guilt are related. But again, with loving kindness meditation, we can overcome this this negativity, the judgmental thoughts, and letting go of that negative image. Now, an important aspect of wisdom, of awakening, is to understand what thinking is. Very important. Because as you know, we're not taught to understand the thinking process. We're only taught subjects. And we have to study. Study in school in order to pass exams. But we're never taught to understand what thinking is. Because you begin to see that thinking is really what is creating most of our mental, emotional suffering and conflicts. We're not taught to understand the benefits of thinking, but also the destructive aspects of thinking. Because it's obvious that we need thinking in daily life, but you find that when we don't need to think, the mind keeps thinking unnecessarily, right? We tend to think too much. And although we need rational, logical thinking, in daily life, thinking easily becomes very irrational, very illogical, when it becomes obsessive, when it becomes negative, as being too judgmental, too critical, and caught in aversion and ill will.
The Reason Why, a hymn by Awakening. Its lovely, meaningful, and appealing tones resonate with listeners. Let's indulge in some soul-stirring music by Awakening. concludes today's broadcast. If you have any concerns or questions, please don't hesitate to contact us at info@buddhadharmatv.com. Thank you for watching, and we are confident that our program on Buddha Dharma TV will inspire peace lovers around the world. Good night. Namo Buddhaya.